lineup of speakers. Yeah, now recording. So before we start, just for GDPR purposes, I wanted to let you know the session is being recorded, and we'll be making recording available to all participants after the webinar. Your microphones will be muted during the webinars. We have a large number of participants. However, we do encourage you to submit questions and comments via the chat feature on Zoom, which I guess everyone is familiar with these days. And we'll pick up the questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. The webinar should last up to about 1.5 hours. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Craig McCoy. I'm the chair of the LHR Connection, which is a role I've had for the last 8 years. I'm also a senior HR director with 35 years experience in the profession. I'm a fellow of the CIPD. I've held 16 HR director roles, both as a permanent as an interim. A few words about London HR Connection. We're a long-established professional networking group for anyone with the interest in the world of HR, originally established in the 1980s. Our origins were within the CIPD. We remain affiliated to the CIPD, but we have an independent board of 9 senior HR professionals. In normal times, pre-pandemic, if you remember that, we were known for our live events with guest speakers and great networking. Unfortunately, at the moment, no canapes and no wine. We hope to be getting back to live events very soon, so watch this space. We are a not-for-profit organisation. Our model is based on commercial sponsorship in order to cover our running costs. And the slide at the start of this webinar showed the current annual sponsors. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Denise. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our sponsor for today's webinar is leading HR recruitment business, Network HR, part of the Executive Network Group. Chris Rowlands is the Group Director for the Executive Network Group. He's joined today by a panel of highly experienced speakers on the topic of social mobility. So in no particular order, Bharati Krak, who is the former MD of Crédit Agricole, with broad senior experience in corporate banking, telecoms and retail. Mac Alonge, who is the CEO of the Equal Group, dedicated to eliminating bias within traditional and new systems and processes. And finally, Athol Duncan, who is chair of the Black Isle Group, chair of UK Coaching, and amongst other things, the published author of the book, Leaders in Lockdown. A very strong panel today will be sharing their considerable experience in a range of issues relating to social mobility. Now, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Chris Rowlands, who'll be hosting the webinar. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Craig. How do I compete with that? I won't try. Thanks, everyone. Really great to have you all logged in today. We are very keen to keep this conversational and interactive as much as possible. So let's start there, shall we? I'd like to start us off with a quote, if I may. 2 reasons. 1, who doesn't like a quote? Everyone likes a quote. And 2, Craig alluded to it. We'd like to get you guys in the chat function as early as possible. So we'll get your chat fingers moving, if you wouldn't mind, stretch them out. I'd like you in the chat just to have a guess, and I'll put a prize in there. Athol will sign a book and we'll send it to you. I didn't warn him about that. I'll pay for it and send it. As to who we can attribute this quote to. So I think it's a pertinent quote. So let's start there in the chat function, please. And just as Craig mentioned, we're going to use the chat for everything today. So your questions, your comments, your ponderings, your disagreements, everything in the chat, please, and we will utilize that, especially through the Q&A. So here's the quote: "You will find talent, genius, care, imagination, and enthusiasm everywhere in this country. All of them evenly distributed, but opportunity is not." Who said that? We have our first answer. I'll let a few more come through before I tell you if you're correct or not. The panelists can actually contribute to this because I didn't warn you I was going to do that.
We might need to offer something better than the book, Chris.
Well, I think based on who said the quote, perhaps we don't, Athol.
Oh, all right, okay.
So we've had 4 correct answers. Nigel Toon, you were the first, and we've had 5 subsequent answers, all correct. Yes, our illustrious leader, Boris Johnson, made that statement just yesterday. He also said that the UK is one of the most imbalanced societies and lopsided economies of any Western country. So This is certainly not a political debate. I will not line myself up with Bojo in any way, shape or form, but I think the quote is pertinent, and I'm sure the phrase levelling up will be mentioned at least once today. So Craig made the introduction. For those who don't know me, I'm Chris Rowlands of the Executive Network Group. We are the parent company to Network HR, who I'm sure and hope many of you know. My colleague Adam Oliver, give us a wave, Adam, is here with me today. And Adam's the director of Network HR. I'm sure many more of you know him than you do I. But I'm going to hand over to our guests and our panelists today. Very excited to put this panel together, and lots of experience. But just to personalise the introduction, because Craig did such a good job of giving you, I guess, their professional background. Just a quick intro from each of you, please, and just an overview of what life's been like for you over the last 12, 18 months. It's been a roller coaster for everyone. And I think there's no better way to get to know you. So I'm just going to go left to right on my screen. Athol, would you mind starting us off?
Okay, so as Craig said, I'm the chair of the leadership development business, Black Isle Group. I'm an executive coach, and I sit on quite a few different boards. I chair the Scottish salmon industry, and I thought, Chris, maybe if we'd offered a bit of salmon, we might have got more offers in the chat than the book. What has the last 18 months been like for me? Well, I could use 3 words, I think: stressful, opportunity, and life-changing. And I say stressful because at the start of this, like many people on the call, every business I was involved in was in some pretty serious degree of jeopardy. They were all going off at the one time. And when you're a non-exec, I think you can cope with one business having a big issue, but when all 5 are seriously in danger, that's a pretty scary moment. Life-changing because I'm one of these crazy people, like many folk on the call, who got up at 5 o'clock most mornings or 6 o'clock and did planes, trains and automobiles. And I haven't done any of that in the last 18 months, starting to do it again. I had lots of time to spend at home, spend with my family. And then opportunity, because all the businesses have seen great opportunity out of it now. And I thought about that as a leader. I put my hand on my heart and say, all the changes that we have now done, we could have done without COVID. Why did we not do that?
And that question may be answered later. So Bharati, you're in the middle of my screen.
Okay, thank you. Well, I decided in the middle of 2019 to actually take a break from corporate life and actually have some time with the family, which got extended, obviously, but also just to pursue other interests. And I think stopping work when I did was a massive change. And then 6 months later, I had an even bigger change because of the pandemic. And I think what was interesting for me was actually not actually being involved in corporate life anymore, but seeing the impact the pandemic was having specifically on my profession, and that's the HR profession. Because all of a sudden it became very evident that leaders didn't know what to do, so they all turned to their HRDs or their heads of people. What do we do? How do we sort this out? What does it mean by everyone working from home? So I was then able to spend time actually supporting a number of colleagues and people through my business, just to actually manage all of this, because all of a sudden HR was centre stage. And also it got me to reflect actually on how lucky I've been in terms of my career, because of my humble origins, which is why social mobility is so important to me, because it was through the lucky breaks that I got that I managed to become an MD in a corporate investment bank. Otherwise it wouldn't have happened. So I'm very much a product of social mobility. And that's why when I saw what was happening with the pandemic, and I know we're going to touch upon this later on, and I saw what was happening, not just to people under 25, but also school children and the challenges that they were facing, and seeing the impact of that going forward, then I decided that this is something I've really got to do something about. So that's why I'm here.
Great, good. Certainly that resonates with me. I won't go into my background, but there's definitely some similarities there, Bratty.
Yeah.
And Mac?
Hi, yes, Mac Alonge, CEO of the Equal Group. And, you know, in response to your question, I'll talk both from personal perspective and from professional perspective. So from personal perspective, the last 18 months has been quite challenging. So I've recently become a father. So balancing that in context of pandemic and sleepless nights and nappies and all of that has been challenging, to say the least. Similar to Athol, you know, prior to pandemic, I was up at 5 and kind of working until the late hours. And the pandemic has really changed that dynamic and made me really sit back and think about what we do, how we engage in work, both individually and collectively. And I think as a business, we've also experienced quite a significant growth through the pandemic, which has meant that we've had to deal with a lot more people issues. But I think as we kind of go back into quote unquote the real world, now we're starting to think about how we create a new dynamic in terms of how we interact as an organization. What is the new normal? What does that look like? Is it people in offices? Is it virtual? Is it hybrid? And also realizing that different people in the company want different things. So some people really want to be office-based, others want to be completely virtual, and there's probably the majority that's somewhere in between. So really wrestling with how we do that better, but also looking at individuals' needs in terms of you know, work-life balance and managing work around your personal life, which is something I think collectively we weren't as proactive about prior to the pandemic, but something that, as I thought alluded to, that we're taking more seriously post-pandemic.
Great, and we've had the pleasure of working together, haven't we, Mac, recently, certainly over the last 6 to 12 months. So I'm sure we'll touch on that later. So not only will this be interactive, I think it's certainly not on me to ask the best questions. That would be the worst idea ever. So certainly the panelists, I'm sure, will interact and ask each other questions as the information flows, and we'll certainly do our best to include your questions in the chat as well. So let's just paint a bit of a picture, shall we? That there's so much out there, studies, statistics in terms of what the social mobility landscape looks like in the UK. Bratty, we did a Q&A with you recently, didn't we? And some of the insight that you provided, I'd love for you to touch on that shortly. But I thought you know, we've heard from Boris. Let's hear from the people, shall we? So the Social Mobility Barometer is a survey run by the Social Mobility Commission, which I'm sure many of you may be aware of. And this is what the public thinks. So over half the public, so 56%, think the pandemic increased social inequality, from not a particularly good starting point, let's be honest. And the poll that they ran also exposed that 4 in 5 adults, so 79%, believe there is a large gap between different social classes. 3/4 think there's a large differences in opportunities across Britain. As an example of that, 31% of people in the Northeast believe opportunities to progress in their area are good, compared to 75% in London. So the disparities are clear. I'm sure those numbers just back up people's general feeling around the subject, which seems to be it's bad and it's getting worse. So let's not be too negative. I think there's lots for us to kind of draw upon, and there's lots of good ideas, and I think that's the theme of today, is not for us to just talk around the topic, but for everyone to leave this with something they can put into place and go in action. And I think we've got great examples of companies who are doing that, and programs that are doing that. So there's some of the stats. We're going to start, there's sort of 3 phases to this. We're going to start with some of those programs that I alluded to: social enterprise, community-based programs, industry-led programs. So I'm going to come to Mac shortly to talk about some of the work that his business has been doing with the Greater London Authority. We're then going to go into the role of business leaders. We've got Athol, who wrote the book Leaders in Lockdown, so it would be remiss not to, but Bratty's also been heavily involved in this area of actual corporate advocacy and what it means for leaders to act as change agents in this space. And the final part really is I guess where Adam and I can help a little bit in terms of how can businesses tap into and attract underrepresented groups, but also what steps can HR professionals and HRDs take in order to really hold the mirror up to their own business and move the dial in the right direction. So let's start with some of these programs. Mac, I keep seeing your name linked to Sadiq Khan. So talk to us about some of the work that Equal Group are doing at the moment with the Greater London Authority.
Yeah, thank you. And I wanted to take a moment to just reflect on something that Bharati was saying in terms of that personal interest in social mobility. You know, I'm the product of a working class family, and you know, have benefited from social mobility over the years, and I think it's something that I reflect on from an intersectional perspective. And I think sometimes we look at social mobility as quite a linear concept, not necessarily appreciating the intersections that exist in relation to socioeconomic background and some of the other protected characteristics. And I say that as a segue into talking about some of the work that we're doing with Sadiq and his team at the Greater London Authority. So essentially that programme, I'll rewind a little bit and give a little bit of background. So a couple of years ago, Sadiq commissioned a piece of work to look at inequalities in and across London. And what they found was that young Black men were specifically at risk when it comes to employment and education and the chances that you can have within industry and careers. So they set up an initiative called the Workforce Integration Network, really designed to target companies that were significant employers in and around London and encourage those organisations to do a little bit more and take a little bit more of an active role in pushing social equality and social justice. And what came out of that was a concept called the Design Labs. So that is a programme targeted at 16 to 24-year-old young Black men in London, but really looking at it not necessarily from the individual perspective, but looking at it organisationally to say, what are the opportunities for organisations to do more in improving the recruitment and retention of young Black men in the construction and infrastructure sectors. So we've been working with 20 organisations over the last 11 months to really take them on a journey to understand what are the needs for intervention across the employee life cycle for young Black men specifically, looking at the issues culturally within individual organisations and across the sector. So the construction and infrastructure sector is particularly poor performing when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And there's plenty of opportunities across how these organisations are structured, the policies and procedures that are implemented within these organisations, and the culture that is at the heart of those sectors. And over the 11 months that we've been working, and I see Pam just posted a link very helpfully in the chat, so do check it out. It's probably a more well-rounded overview of what we're doing with these organisations and also who's involved. And essentially we've been on a journey with them. We've looked at recruitment, we've looked at the impact that the supply chain can have on social mobility as well as social justice in relation to young Black men specifically. But really looking at things not necessarily from a job perspective, because often organisations can look at I guess social mobility, diversity and inclusion as opening a door of opportunity for a job and not necessarily look at it in terms of a career. And I think from a social mobility perspective, it's really about how do we encourage people to engage in organisations, engage in industries with a longer term perspective. So this isn't just about creating jobs that are good for 1 or 2 years, but really seeing their own ability to progress within organisations, progress across industries, and start to take up leadership positions and positions of influence within specific sectors. So that programme kind of comes to an end at the end of 2021, but already we're starting to have conversations around how do we ensure that the legacy of that programme lives on beyond 2021.
Good. And just out of interest, so why you mentioned some of the challenges and some of the specific challenges of the construction sector. I noticed it's now extended to the technology sector, which is particularly sort of different beast, I should imagine. Why start with construction? Was it seen as a great opportunity, or was it seen as the biggest challenge to fix, if you like?
Probably a little bit of both, but I guess the real kind of strategic thinking behind that was, I'm sure you would have all heard the phrase building back better. So over the next couple of years, you know, construction and infrastructure will play a clear
Can't
role.
get away from him, can we?
Yeah, construction and infrastructure is going to play a huge role in the economic recovery across the UK, specifically in London, where there's a number of significant programs, if you mention kind of Crossrail and HS2 and a number of other, you know, large infrastructure programs that are happening in and around London. So that is, a lot of them are kind of 5 to 10 year projects that are going to be significant employers, not just from a design and build perspective, but also from a maintenance perspective. So looking 10, 15, 20 years into the future, typically the length of people's careers. So if you get in there, use that opportunity to diversify and bring different faces and background into the sector, hopefully we can then leverage that and turn that into careers.
And I guess the dearth of talent in STEM and engineering is well documented, isn't it? So I'm happy to throw some programs I know in there. I'd welcome the attendees to do the same as well. If you've partnered with any programs, partnered with any particular charities or organisations, then please do drop it in the group there. But on that front in particular, there's a program called Primary Engineer, which, believe it or not, this resonates with me. I've got a 5-year-old, and you can now have a chartered engineer at primary school. It's been ratified by government. It's called the Primary Engineer Programme, and that's looking across the UK, and it's regionalised to ensure there's an equitable spread across the UK of businesses who are supporting this primary engineer programme and getting engineering and STEM into primary school age children. Hopefully it sticks with them and stays with them. Bharati, I know when we did the Q&A, you mentioned some of the programs, I guess on a wider scale, things like the Social Mobility Commission. So just give us your take on the programs that are running. Government's obviously got a huge role to play, but that sort of interaction between companies and programs, can you give us some examples that you've seen?
Well, it's not so much examples as obviously some of the things that the Social Mobility Foundation, there's also the Social Mobility Pledge, which companies can sign up to, which relates to outreach and recruitment and those sorts of things. But I think I obviously sit in the southeast and obviously very close to London. There seems to be quite a lot going on in London, and even as a mentor with the Social Mobility Foundation, I can see that there's a lot of focus in London. And I guess one of the things that I want to sort of make a point about is the fact that there needs to be much more done outside of the southeast. And where I live on the Essex-Suffolk border, and you know, we've got seaside towns that have had underinvestment, poor educational outcomes, you know, all of those sorts of things. There's a real issue there. So the Social Mobility Commission has put together a 7-pillar plan, which 4 elements actually relate to stuff that the government has to do, which is around poverty, which is around education, all of those sorts of things. And there are 3 that relate to employers. One of them is looking at apprenticeships and those early careers and offering those and mentoring. And the other one is commitment to skills training and education in terms of the workplace. So there are frameworks there for employers, and certainly with the Social Mobility Foundation, they've got the employer index, which you probably know, and I think PwC came top of that last year in terms of 2020, in terms of the activity that they did, and there's a really good framework there and structure to assist businesses, but there still needs to be more. And if you look at the educational outcomes, you know, from last year in terms of the percentage of, you know, the months missed, you know, because of the pandemic, when you look at the number of pupils that go into university who've had free school meals, that's, you know, and there was a study done by the Education Subcommittee in June 2021. And that just sort of was very evident that there was a real issue in terms of statistics there for kids with free school meals going to university. And yet, you know, when I think about the profession, you know, the role that I left, we constantly were looking at graduates, and we were obviously targeting Russell Group universities, and we know that, you know, 6% of the population attends private schools, and yet 30% are represented in Russell Group universities. So we are compounding the issues of social mobility.
And how do you think, or what programs do you think are in place to spread that message? You mentioned the employer index. If I was to take an adversarial point, I'd say that the top 5 are all professional services businesses. And is it a corporate index for the corporate world? And frankly, they've got a lot of money to throw at these programs and tick the boxes and make them, you know, pat each other on the back. So how do we ensure that it's more than that it's not just sort of tokenism and a badge on a website, that it's actually more than that?
Well, I think what's interesting is, and that's why I don't know if you want me to talk about it now, or we'll be talking about it in a minute, but the work that the leaders as change agents are doing, because that isn't just about the corporate world, you know, the big corporations who have shareholders that they have to think about when it comes to their CSR responses or their ESG responses, because this is what this comes under, if you want to be brutally honest about all of this. This is also about the small employer up in the northwest or the northeast. It's about access to talent. It's about being part of your community and being seen as being part of your community and having a positive impact in your community. It's about partnering with local tech colleges and schools to talk about the careers in your business. I mean, we know at the moment there's a real issue with a shortage of skills, a shortage of talent. And so this is a way of, if you like, being visible in your community.
Great. I think that very neatly takes us on, actually, Bharati, in terms of the roles of leaders. If only we had someone who'd written a book on the subject, eh? So look, we've had a couple of sessions discussing your book. I found some of the conclusions and some of the interviews fascinating. So if we can narrow in on this specific topic, I think there's 2 probably areas where you can support this conversation. I thought one is the role of entrepreneurism, because I think that can often be a leveler or an opportunity to level, but also just the appetite at that leadership level of, you know, big multinational organizations to have an impact on this and actually genuinely change circumstances for individuals. So do you want to talk us through your conclusions?
Sure. So the project that we did at Black Isle Group, Leaders in Lockdown, followed 28 global business leaders through the pandemic to see, you know, how did they lead and what was the most successful leadership in the pandemic, but also how was the world, what were their insights into how the world was going to change. And we pulled it into 7 big themes, 7 big themes that leadership would need to get a grip of, and that hopefully were the things that would change society. And probably the most relevant one here is that, you know, very early on in the pandemic, these leaders were saying to us, this is going to widen inequality in every way. You know, from the people who were most infected by the virus, the people who died from the virus, the people who lost their jobs. If you look now at the rollout of the vaccine, and I think I saw something the other day saying 1 in 4 countries, the poorest countries in the world, haven't yet put 1 jab in 1 arm. The people who suffered most in education, how the economies of the poorest countries will struggle to recover from this the most much. So inequality widening in absolutely every way. But there's a real opportunity in this area now, because I think before the pandemic, certainly in the boards that I was involved in, this was seen as, social mobility was seen as something which was about altruism. And okay, it was driven by some individuals who believed in social justice, but it wasn't mainstream in the boardroom. Well, as Bharati's saying, there's three huge changes happening right at the moment. The skills migration, the great resignation, and the lost generation, right? The skills migration is the fact that, you know, partly due to Brexit, how much is Brexit, how much is COVID? I'll leave other people to argue about, but we've lost so many workers out of the UK. The great resignation, because what's happened has made people think, do I want to do this job? Do I want to work in this company? Do I want to work in this sector? Do I want to work at all? So I think I saw a survey saying 40% of workers in the city were considering what they were going to do next. And then the lost generation are really the university kids and the school kids who have lost their education over the last, I mean, it's more than 3 years of education that they'll have disrupted. And what will that mean? So I think this Bharati, this war on talent, and these three huge changes means that a lot of social mobility has to become mainstream. It's now a matter of business necessity. It's not altruism. And if I can chuck out a couple of stats just to shock us about where we're starting from, 70% of the jobs in the city are held by people who went to fee-paying or the top grammar schools. So 70% of the jobs have gone to 10% of society in investment banking, law, population. And you know, in the UK, the salary that someone earns is more linked to what their father earned than in any other country in the developed world. So we're starting from a very low and poor situation. We've not mentioned class yet and the class system yet, but there are huge changes that I would hope, with good leadership, would start to drive social mobility into the mainstream and into business necessity, Chris.
Okay. And leadership, I think you should pick that one up, Bharati. I think you alluded to it earlier. There's a close connection.
Yes, I did. So I've started to work with an organisation called the Leaders as Change Agents. And they're a board of volunteer business leaders as well as government sponsored. And what they are really looking to do, and this is why it's quite exciting for me, and I believe it's a real game changer, is actually pull everything together and to focus in on that relationship between the employer and the employee. Because certainly throughout my career, I've seen, and I've worked in organisations where it's been very paternalistic. And now, and I think, again, because of COVID and what happened and the fact that managers then had to trust employees that they were working from home, and my goodness, all of those sorts of things and the challenges they had, we've now got this opportunity, as Mac alluded to really sort of reset, you know, how we operate. So what Leaders as Change Agents have done is they've put together a guide, and it's got 8 commitments for organisations, for employers and employees. So it's very much a joint thing. And what's exciting about what they talk about in relation to diversity, equality and inclusion is that they don't then have, so this is what you should be doing on gender, and this is what you need to be doing on race, and this is what you need to be doing on social mobility. They're actually bringing it all together, because one of the things that I feel very strongly about as an HR professional is that we spend a lot of time talking about diversity and inclusion, and then we start talking about the protected characteristics. But actually, if we come back to actually looking at social mobility as that cornerstone, if you like, of all of this, then by doing work on that, you know what, you're actually going to make progress in the race area or the gender area or, you know, neurodiversity area or whatever, because actually it does cut across all characteristics. and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. It's actually, you know, quite easy to do. You just need to follow some principles. But that's for HR. But the big push and the big thing is the leaders. They've got to understand, they've got to be committed to it. They've got to see why it's important to do. They've got to be the advocates out there. They've got to internally talk about it, externally talk about it, you know, and challenge where people, you know, don't get it and don't think they need to be doing this. Because we really are missing this massive talent pool, and it is just shocking. It's breathtakingly shocking if we don't do something about it. So the guide that leaders as change agents have put together is coming out at the end of the month, and it really is a how-to guide, not just about, you know, being inclusive and all the things that, you know, fairness and opportunity, but also about improving productivity, which is something that is on the agenda at a particular conference that they had this week.
I think it would be good once that's live, Bharati, if you could share.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've
actually got a copy of it, but I can't share it at the moment.
Oh, no, you're amongst friends, Bharati, I'm sure. I'm picking up some of the message. I'm trying not to ask the questions as they come through. There's some great comments and questions in there. But isn't part of this, and this is the last stat I've got, I promise this won't be a stat fest, but isn't part of this that probably in the past it's been seen as a skills issue, a training issue, and actually what that ignores is the detachment and the apathy of a group of people that actually, if you don't want to be part of a talent pool, you don't need to be part of a talent pool. And the example I was about to give is that there was a study called Driving Social Mobility, which looked at, to go to Mac's point of intersectional data, looked at 55-year-olds as an age group, and they saw the biggest barrier for their own mobility as skills and education. But once you looked at the 18 to 34-year-olds, and that's the reason we named this session today, who controls your future, the top 5 were all things that are outside of their control. So some of them were traditional protected characteristics, ethnicity, gender and disability, but 2 of them were where people grow up and a lack of support network. And if people have this innate belief that things outside of their control are the biggest determinants as to whether they can get on in life, then surely that's the thing that we need to crack, alongside obviously skills and training, with lots of mentoring programs that seem to be based around traditional skills and training based programs. Mac, I know that you've worked with lots of companies to look at their inclusion statistics and help them push their dial forward, but I know for a fact from the work we've done together that includes social mobility data as well. Just talk us through, I guess, some of the companies that have been able to push that forward and have made positive strides there.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I was reflecting on what Bharati said earlier in terms of the focus around social mobility sometimes being London and seeing that as a hotbed of activity, particularly in financial services, professional services and service-based economies. We did some extensive work with the Offshore Wind Industry Council last year to really look at what best practice looks like in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion specifically. And the background to that is that the government have what is known as the Offshore Wind Sector Deal, and they have put 250 million pounds into the offshore wind sector because they see that as a key growth area over the next couple of decades. And one of the things that they're targeting through that investment is an increase in the types of people that are involved in the energy sector, specifically the offshore wind sector. And the reason I mention that is because offshore wind as a sector is based in hubs outside of London. So we're looking at areas in the northeast, we're looking at areas in kind of the west of England and the east of England, closer to the I guess historically industrialized areas, which, as we know, have had a specifically hard time in relation to social mobility, access to jobs, and generally, you know, you mentioned it in the introduction, Chris, in terms of leveling up. You know, how do we level up some of the areas across the nation that have historically been disenfranchised and don't necessarily have access to the same opportunities as people.
Sorry, I was about to say some of those seaside towns that Bharati mentioned earlier. I'm from
Grimsby
North
was
Wales.
one of them.
Grimsby, I saw a good piece on the news recently about Grimsby. I'm from North Wales. There's a huge offshore wind farm off the coast of North Wales as well. So I think that's a great example, Max. So can you tell us a little bit more?
Yes, definitely. So the work essentially was to produce a best practice guide for organisations. The estimates currently are that the sector by 2030 will create an additional 27,000 jobs, and attached to the investment that the government have made, they've also set the industry targets in terms of gender diversity, so ensuring that 40% of the workforce is females, and obviously further work to do in terms of setting a target for Black, Asian, minority ethnic individuals, but really just being open to the fact that, you know, when we're considering social mobility, we're considering access to jobs, it's not just about job creation, but also about enterprise creation. So a lot of these, you know, a lot of the sector is dependent on supply chains, and supply chains are a great opportunity for entrepreneurship. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, I'm not sure how the stats support this, Chris, but in terms of the key levers of social mobility, we often look at education and don't necessarily look at the areas of technical skills and entrepreneurship. And when I was reflecting in preparation for this, you know, I was reflecting on the fact that a lot of people have the technical skills, but don't necessarily have the business skills to really create long-term wealth and a vehicle to you know, work their way out of a kind of the current situation. So the offshore wind sector have this best practice guide, and it is going to be updated with case studies as the industry develops and as people start to engage with this work more holistically. But part of that guide is to open people up to the idea of using data to inform what they do, when they do it, and how they do it.
And is there something in that? Because I know you've done a lot of work with energy utility skills and the wider energy sector, if you like. Is there an opportunity there? You know, Adam and I will probably have a wry smile every time we hear a sector say that their sector's unattractive. The energy utilities say, well, no one wants to work in our sector because we dig holes all day long, or who wants to work in FS because it's just all numbers on a spreadsheet. The truth is that every sector has a level of attractiveness, and it's a bit too easy just to say, well, we've got our own attraction issues. I think the energy utility sector is one where they have pulled together and made a real concerted effort to reach out to and I could see some of the comments in there, you know, school age children, those kind of disenfranchised and disengaged kind of groups. Are there any other examples? I'm just a little bit closer to that, Mark, and you and I guess we're a little bit closer to that energy utility sector. Is there some good work going on in other sectors that I guess can be replicated?
Is that a question for me?
If you know of any, then definitely a question for you, Matt. But Athol or Bharati, I'd welcome your thoughts as well.
No, I haven't got any examples, I'm afraid.
I think that's a real shame, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you pick up, Mac, the work that's going on in the energy utility, the wider sector, I mean, that would be probably good for people.
Yeah, definitely. So one outside of kind of the energy sector, one of the things that comes to mind is kind of the national school. So there's a national school for digital skills. They're set up in, don't quote me on this, 2016, 17. And their ethos is really about bringing digital skills to the forefront in a way that engages young people outside of kind of traditional education. You know, traditional education hasn't really changed in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the subjects that people study. And I think what you tend to find is that isn't as attractive as digital. You know, digital is something that, this new generation is digital first. They're used to devices and technology in a way that previous generations haven't been. And really what they've done is to create curriculum based around practical skills. So how do you practically use digital skills in a work environment, you know, looking at technology and marketing and the way that work is done digitally, as opposed to what kind of traditional schools teach in terms of maths and science and kind of other subjects. In terms of the energy and utility skills work, a lot of what they focus on is talent and looking at the future skills gap, and really trying to create interactions between big organizations and the future workforce, if you like, creating apprenticeship programs. So I know a lot of the organizations have engaged with the government's Kickstarter program to get individuals into the organization, typically from kind of lower socioeconomic backgrounds. There's some great work going on with Thames Water. Hopefully they won't mind me pointing to them specifically, but really engaging in trying to use apprenticeships as a vehicle to get people in to understand what the industry looks like, what the sector looks like, using rotations as well, so giving people not just exposure to one job but a number of jobs to really see where their interest lies. And I think it's probably a good point to talk about the way that the industry is moving, not just the energy sector but construction as well. Looking at the future use of technology. So in the construction sector, starting to look at smart buildings and digital twin, which is a concept where you have a digital asset, so a building, the digital model, how that interacts with the physical model. Typically with computer-aided design, the use of drones in infrastructure, all of this is really interesting stuff, but they have to create this ability to interact with the people that it will be interesting for. So one of the things that we've done on the Greater London Authority work is a recruitment drive where businesses have come in, and the first one we did, we had over 1,000 people sign up, but really just to hear about the types of opportunities that are currently in the sector and also understanding what the future trajectory of the sector is.
I'm muting myself there. I was just having a quick scan through the chat there. We're probably now onto the section where we want to look at some meaningful actions and things that we can all be doing. We talked about the role of government. We have our first Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Mr. Gove. So we'll see what his approach takes. But I think that there has to be a role for business and a proactive role for business. Lots of the comments in the chat take us all the way back to school age. We've alluded to some of the challenges in there. Certainly the primary engineer program that I mentioned earlier, they do a wonderful event every year where they have 5 and 6 year olds right through to 15-year-olds who just answer the question, if I were an engineer for a day, I would. And they put a design together, and the winner is they actually build a version through some of the university partners that they have for the winner each year, and it's incredible. So I think it's about engaging those at school level. But one of the questions that's come through, I guess, back to business, in particular professional services, who, according to the Employer Index, do very well in this space. They've talked about KPMG's commitment to tracking parental occupation. Bharati, I know this came out in our Q&A. Could you pick that up and just talk?
No, absolutely. So I think 2 or 3 weeks ago they made a big announcement. The fact that I think they wanted something like 29-30% of their directors and partners to have come from sort of lower socioeconomic groups by 2030. There's a couple of things there. The question that they're going to be asking applicants is a question, there's 3 questions actually that the Social Mobility Commission advocate. And the first one's probably the easiest one to answer, which is around what the occupation of the main earner in the household was when you were age 14. And there is a drop-down menu, and that gives you a good indication whether they were in, a professional job or a sort of semi-skilled or unskilled role. So there's a drop-down menu, and that's a question that's advocated by the Social Mobility Commission, and that's the one that KPMG are going to be using. So that's what they're going to be doing. But I think the thing that was really impressive for me, coming back to the leadership piece, is the fact that it was both the chairman and the chief executive who came out and talked about this. and wanted everyone to know what they were doing and why they felt that this was important. So it was showing and demonstrating real leadership, both internally and externally. So, you know, and I know I've, you know, worked with KPMG previously in terms of just interacting with them, and I know that they've done quite a lot around apprenticeships as well, and looking at that as opposed to just focusing in on graduates. Yeah. So I think they've done you know, a lot of really good work in this area.
And Chris, I used to work in the accountancy profession and was involved in trying to solve some of these problems. And I think that the KPMG piece is great. As Bharati says, it's great that it's got buy-in right from the top. But the accountancy world is starts from a very low base.
Yes.
And we created a foundation, and the foundation was to try and bring people from less advantaged backgrounds into the profession. And what was fascinating about that was it was not the financial that was the barrier. What was the real problem with these young people was they lacked a mentor, they lacked a support, they lacked somebody who could help them through the issues that they would find in their university education and in the workplace. The mentor was the most crucial thing, because this is taking people into an environment that is entirely, it's not, you know, the middle class household with the professional parents. You know, you have this mentor with you all the time because your mother and your father might have been there, and it's a familiar and expected environment. The real power is the mentor, and I would actually start to go further than that when I started to think this through, because we could get people into these businesses, but can we retain them? If it feels so awkward in such a different world? And, you know, why do we not give them real coaching? Because I think in a lot of the schemes, we offer the people mentors, but we spend the money on the executive coaching, on the real coaching. We spend that at the top end. But if we really believe in this, why are we not helping these people with their inner game, with their imposter syndrome, with their confidence, with understanding that their past will always shape their future? All these kind of things that we work on with the most senior people. If we really want to put these folk into the mainstream, why don't we invest in that to retain them? And my own experience is two things. I didn't have a university education, although the place that I went became a university, but I think most places became a university at some stage. So I think I was at a polytechnic doing a vocational course for a year. And it was great, you know, what Tony Blair did to open up university education to so many people. And we'll all hear stories of, you know, families who'd never sent anyone to university prior to that Tony Blair government now got access to it. But there's a university problem now for me, and that's the kids who don't want to go to university or you know, are told that they can't go to university. They get the worst teachers. They get the least time with the career advisors. They're the least likely to travel, you know, want to travel or go and work somewhere else. And we're kind of treating kids who don't want to go to university as second-class citizens. And I really think that's something that we need to factor in a massive way to social mobility.
And are there any business? I was reading the chat alongside that conversation, and mentoring networks. I mean, we're on the London HR Connection, that connectivity and interaction and opportunity. I'll go back to the study I mentioned earlier. You know, lack of support network was the second or equal highest amongst 18 to 34-year-olds. So how do we overcome that problem? How do we actually create these networks that are meaningful? There's lots of mentor programs. I know of one called the 1 Hour Project, which I think is doing some good work, but it seems to be in small pockets. So how do we make sure that there isn't that disconnect?
Well, I think certainly the Social Mobility Foundation have got their mentor program, which is great, and I've been a mentor on that for the last 3 years. But I think there is something about not just focusing obviously on the university education, as Atul talked about. Not all kids want to be going to university, or they've had the encouragement, or they've got the aspiration to go to university. You know, we need to look at things like apprenticeships. We also need to look at, when we offer work experience in our organisation, you know, actually opening it up to perhaps some of the local schools or colleges in your area, to start to build a relationship, start to actually go in and talk about the jobs and the careers that are in your organisation. Give people that opportunity, you know, to come and experience, to come and look and come and learn. I think the mentoring is key. It's you know, mentoring, keeping in touch with people who are successful in their applications to come in, and helping them, you know, make sure that they're okay and going through the organisation. But also for the people that aren't successful, actually perhaps then offering to, you know, mentor them or help them understand why they've not been successful, if they come from, you know, the groups that we're talking about. But the culture of the organisation is critical. It's all very well and good getting them through the door, but if you haven't got a culture that is supportive, which is why it's interesting that KPMG are going for 30%, because at least you've got some critical mass there. This isn't about tokenism. This is about actually creating a community that hopefully will start to change the culture in the organisation, because you've got that critical mass. But I think that is really key, because a lot of these youngsters, and I remember myself, you don't know what the rules are in the organisation. You've never had that experience. You haven't had parents telling you, or the opportunity to have the work experience. So it's, you know, the power play, that it seems opaque. It's you know, and there's pressure to assimilate as well. And, you know, I still remember, you know, people talking to me about going skiing and having, you know, this, that and the other holidays, and it was alien to me, you know. So it's that's the piece that I think is always the challenge, and that's why it's really important that leaders and you know, executive teams really talk about this openly, and are aware of needing to create that inclusive society, culture for everyone.
Absolutely. My alien story is that I joined the BBC when I was about 21 in Glasgow, and I was seconded to Lime Grove in London to Newsnight, right? And it was just an extension of Oxbridge. I think I was probably the only person in the morning meeting who hadn't been to Oxbridge, and the morning meeting was like an extension of the Oxford Union Debating Society, and they talked about countries and people that I had never heard of.
Yeah.
But you know, when a new story happened, and you had to move quickly, and you had to do something and get something done and make some decisions, these folk couldn't do it. And I think two of them ended up being director generals of the BBC, and one ended up running Channel 4. But they really couldn't do it. And you know, I had it was tough, but I had the resilience, and I poked them back. But a lot of people wouldn't. A lot of people would just go, "Oh, what's this all about? Just get me back home, get me north again, get me back to Grimsby or back to Edinburgh or Glasgow." You know,
I think it's
sorry, back on.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think it's a really important point in terms of leadership and control, and reflecting on what Bharati was saying about, you know, KPMG's intention to not just look at things tokenistically, but really make sure that there's a critical mass. One of the things that we're big advocates for is collaboration and partnership. You know, it's not just about a top-down approach where leaders that don't have that lived experience are then shaping initiatives and strategies about how to you know, level the playing field, or how to make more of an inclusive society, but really inviting people that have that lived experience to take control and to have their perspective heard in terms of what they want to see and how to overcome barriers and how to overcome obstacles. You know, not to turn this into government bashing session, but you know, the minister or the leader for leveling up, whatever his title is a private school Oxford educated individual. So how does that person then shape where we go from here.
He was brought up in Aberdeen, Matt. That's quite a disadvantage.
Well, yeah, and I think there's something to be said about, you know, reverse mentoring. So that's something that we've worked on with construction and infrastructure companies, to actually turn the tables and say, actually, a leader who potentially doesn't have the lived experience then sits down with somebody who does have the lived experience, and they're able to glean insights and understand what life looks like from that person's perspective.
I know Balfour Beatty are involved in your program, aren't they? And Leo Quinn is the founder of the 5% Club. And if you don't need to look far on LinkedIn, if anyone wants to have a look at some of the videos of him talking about the reverse mentoring, they've been program that they've run through Balfour Beatty. You took the words right in my mouth. The tokenism element of it is the one to avoid. So is there a place for quotas and targets get a bashing, don't they, in D&I around social mobility, but KPMG, that 30%, you're absolutely right, Bratty, that is a strong target, but also creates a critical mass. The prep session for this, I gave these guys an example of a friend of mine, he won't mind me mentioning it, who's recently made a partner of a professional services company. He's from a council estate in Scotland, and the PR team came to me and said, this is great. So we're thinking, obviously, putting some press out on this. How do you feel about council house to C-suite? And he understandably, he was just crushed. You know, he felt he was promoted for that reason. He knew it wasn't true, but it certainly undermined his achievement. And you know, when you can just put one name up there or one face up there to demonstrate, look, you can do it too. That's when people detach, isn't it? So, is there a place for those types of targets, quotas, or however you want to describe them?
Well, I would delegate to my more learned colleagues on that. Certainly, if we don't measure it, we can't manage it, right? So we need to know where we are, and we need to know how we're changing. I think that the well, let me make a slightly different point here. The KPMG scheme is great, and it's great that they've put that out there at this time. But if you look much wider than that, the pace is glacial, isn't it? So one thing we learned in COVID is that we can actually do remarkable things in an incredibly short period of time. We can move millions and millions and millions of people from office to home in weeks, right? We can find a vaccine in 10 months, which would normally take us 10 years. But when it comes to gender equality in the boardroom, we make glacial progress over 40 years. And when it comes to social mobility, we get worse, right? So this is the leadership point. You know, are we really going to show true leadership and make this happen? And then I appreciate that, you know, in the big four, to get there in partners and directors, you can't get rid of all the partners and directors that you have and immediately replace them, you know, but I do just challenge leadership at every level about the pace of progress now, because as we come out of COVID, you know, this is the crossroads to reset and reimagine the world of work. If we don't make progress, if we don't change in the next 6 to 12 months or lay the foundations of change, then there's a great danger that we just go back to where we were before.
And I think my reflections on kind of the use of targets is that it's more important how those targets are met. You know, it's not just a case of going out and cherry picking people just to meet that target, and nothing has changed structurally, nothing has changed in terms of your process, nothing has changed in terms of the foundations of how you arrived at that starting point in the first place. It would be a great shame, and to Atul's point, it would be a missed opportunity to change things fundamentally and in a way that is sustainable long term. So it's really about how you engage in that work. The targets in themselves are, you know, I guess neither bad nor good, but it's a case of really identifying, as I mentioned earlier, the intersections. So making sure that it's as inclusive as possible.
And you know, from the sort of professional perspective, in terms of, you know, HR, we're constantly looking at data and needing to demonstrate data and show why we need to do things and those sorts of things. I think data is important, particularly just to even just get a snapshot of where we are now. But it's about what questions we're asking, it's about what we're going to do with the data, and it's about why we're asking for the data. Why are we asking the questions? You know, why do you want to know? I mean, that's the most important question that an organisation has to answer is why do you want to know? You know, because this is my data, and particularly something like social mobility, because, you know, you're asking me what what the main earner in my family did when I was age 14. Why do you want to know? You know, so I think it's important, again, coming back to the culture, coming back to the leadership, coming back to about what we're trying to do here in terms of this inclusive organisation we want to create. Then it's important that you position everything that you're asking in those terms, in terms of this is to help us understand our population, this is to help us understand where we need to be, this is our baseline, and this is confidential. You don't have to give it to us, but it would be really helpful. You have to obviously explain why you want the data and what you're going to do with it.
One of the on a micro level, and then I think I'll hand over to Craig to pick up some of the Q&A. On a micro level, I can sort of endorse the work that Mac's done with our business. And we really struggled to get people to fill in the D&I surveys through a recruitment process. There was nothing to gain and perceivably everything to lose by giving us that information. And despite all the commitments we made in terms of that information being detached from the process itself, you know, Mac's business has certainly helped us get the commitment rates and the fulfillment rates of those up. One of the things I think that we did, Mac, which is helping organisations to hold a mirror up to themselves, is we get the protected characteristics data, we ask the social mobility questions, but then we also ask that individual about their perception of the organisation that we're presenting them to. And then on an aggregate level, we can present that to a company and say, look, on a scale of, you know, on very simple terms, we go into more detail, but on a scale of 1 to 10, you score an 8 out of 10 for an attractiveness as an employer based on your EVP and their understanding of your EVP. But once we overlay the additional information, to use D&I's example, we say, okay, you're a 9 out of 10 for males, but you're a 5 out of 10 for females. And they can start to then really understand actually how their brand is understood and positioned, and perception's reality, isn't it? It doesn't matter that they feel that they're an inclusive employer if the external perception is very different. And that's something that certainly Mac's helped our organisation to do, and companies I feel are benefiting from that. Hopefully Adam will nod along at this point, but certainly the clients we've worked with where we've gained some momentum in terms of being able to present this information as to how they're perceived within very specific talent pools and very specific demographics, then you can start to do something with it. So that's where the data does become quite powerful, I think. Craig, do you want to pick up some of the questions that have been coming through? I'll try to keep my eye on them. But...
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. So one of the questions which keeps coming up is, where do you find out about all these programs and initiatives, and not also the funding, if there's funding available, but is there one source of information available? Because my experience has been picked up in some of the comments as well, that there are so many different initiatives out there. It's so hard to understand what is available. Is there a one-stop shop that you can find out what's available?
Is that sort of like a how-to guide?
I think,
is that what
I think it's two things. Yeah, I think it's a how-to guide. So how do you go about implementing some sort of initiative or program or process in your organization? But also it's linked as well, what sources of funding, what programs are actually available to you anyway?
Well, certainly one of the guides that I would advocate is the Social Mobility Commission. They've got something called an Employers Toolkit, and it's Socioeconomic Diversity and Inclusion. And that was updated in July 2021. So that's it gives you the framework, data, attraction, you know, hiring. What else we've got? Outreach, progression in the organisation, advocacy, leadership, all of those sorts of things, with some very good examples, as well as what you need to do. So that, I mean, it's out there. Obviously, it also talks about the questions that you can ask in terms of data collection, but that's really good. And then there's also the Social Mobility Foundation Employer Index. And that also has a big emphasis on employee engagement and, you know, what people feel in terms of the organisation, as well as things like blind recruitment. So, you know, you remove names and those sorts of things from CVs, contextual recruitment, all of that sort of stuff. So that's in those two. And then, as I said, later on this month, you've got the Leaders as Change Agents guide, and that's much more holistic, and bringing everything together in the one.
That's really helpful.
That's the one you're going to share with us, isn't it, Bratty? Before
yes, because I'll have an official job then.
Exclusive.
I'll just put my 2 pennies in on the recruitment side of this. I bang the table quite vigorously on this. I've been in the recruitment industry for 20 years, and much of the same processes and the same biases and the same systems of selection go on now as they did 20 years ago when I started out in the industry. And from a HR perspective, I would absolutely encourage people to stop talking and start acting on methods of more inclusive recruitment process. Look, the traditional, when a CV lands, you cannot stop somebody from jumping to the bit of the CV which they feel is most important, and for many that is which university they go to, who do they currently work for, and it's just the same thing repeated over and over again. So look, it's from our perspective, from recruitment agents perspective, that's the thing that we try and talk to our clients about as much as possible, which is, you know, you can make a step change. Athol described it earlier, right? This glacial movement in terms of it changes. If for no other reason, the predictability of most recruitment processes is crap anyway, right? So if you're going to change it, you may as well change it, because the predictability of that process, of an interview process, first, second stage, doesn't really tell you much about whether people are going to be good at the job anyway. So that's my soapbox moment.
Actually, there is a lovely quote that they use in the Social Mobility Commission guide, and they talk about attraction, and they say remove qualification barriers and use inclusive language. For example, we're looking for a spark of potential. Don't worry if you don't think you have it. We're very good at spotting it. And I just think that's lovely.
That's great. And Bharati, all of the guides and toolkits that you mentioned, are they all free to access to anyone?
Yes,
are they
definitely
all in the public domain?
All online, yes. We like free.
Could we put them in the chat, or perhaps after this webinar, actually just circulate the links just so that people do know where to look? Because I think it's really important, because
I'm sure we can do that.
Yeah, I don't think many people would have the first clue where to look, to be honest. But that's always a challenge, isn't it? And then there was a number of, just on the Social Mobility Foundation, I think it was Michael who asked, is the foundation looking for help in terms of mentors, coaches,
yes,
volunteers?
all the time. Yeah. So you can sign up. So that's definitely
excellent. Yeah, that's what people do. And then there were a number of comments about networking, the importance of networking, and the kind of the differential level of skill, if you call it a skill, or inclination even perhaps to get involved in networking. Has anyone come across any practical ways of helping people with networking? Is it a skill which is perhaps something which is, you know, socially developed in the privileged, and that
well, it can be socially developed in the privileged, but generally right across the board. And I've actually been involved in a couple of initiatives to help young people, to teach them how to network. Because the social media world teaches people to be in front of their screen, you know, on the bus or in the bedroom or wherever they are, and it's a very scary experience for people to go, and in professional services in particular, we need to go into the big room and you know, get around the big room and talk to people and network and get business, whether it's for jobs or whatever. So I do think that we could probably do more as part of this package of attracting and retaining to teach folk how to network. And I know quite a few organizations do that, but it's, you know, from a sales perspective, it's quite scary how few younger people, well, how many young people find this very difficult. And, you know, have a serious churn inside about doing it, Craig.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to that point, is it really about starting young? So a number of comments about education, schooling, apprentices. Is it, you know, is it too late as people get older, or can interventions work at a later stage in someone's lifespan?
I think my reflection on the whole networking dynamic is that a lot of people have networks built out of proximity. And I think Atul mentioned it before in terms of his early career connections with people from Oxford and Cambridge and private school and that kind of environment. And a lot of these groups have had the privilege of growing up together and going to the same private school, go to the same academic institution, and then it so happens that you progress into the same professional circles. I think it's the same kind of dynamic. Everybody has a network. It's just about what access that network has to opportunities and to different facilities in kind of a professional sense. I think networking generally comes naturally when you're in the same environment. You tend to build up relationships. So it's about thinking about how can we start to open up some of those opportunities. And I think from an industry perspective, you know, some of the industries that we work in, it's about deliberately and intentionally creating space for that cross-pollination of ideas and cross-pollination of, I guess, personal relationships. You know, when you're working together in a collaborative manner, you tend to get talking, you tend to start to interact on a personal level and continue those relationships forward. So I don't think there's a particular science to it. It's more about creating opportunities and encouraging people to interact in a more diverse and inclusive manner.
Thank you. And I must ask at least one political question, given the Conservative Party conference just finished. So levelling up, does anyone know what it means? Does it have any relevance to this conversation? Is anyone going to do anything differently as part of the Conservative Party agenda for levelling up?
Well, it does have a big relevance because it makes a lot of what we're talking about in part of mainstream debate. But I don't think corporations are going to hang their coat on anything to do with levelling up, because it's going to be trashed by political opponents. It's going to become a political hot potato. We can only control what we can control in the corporate world, and you know, let's focus on that. It would be fair to say that a number of the government schemes have not advanced this cause. I mean, I don't know what people's experiences are of the apprenticeship levy, but right, in the businesses that I'm involved in, the apprenticeship levy has killed apprenticeships. You know, Kickstart is a bit mixed. I hear some people with good experience of Kickstart and other people's without. So we've got to, again, the pandemic teaches us the politicians are over there, they do their stuff, they might help us, they might not help us. And remember, this is the Prime Minister who said during Brexit, F business. So we'll get on and do our own things. Yeah. You know, we're all big enough and bold enough and paid enough to make this change happen ourselves. And that's what we should do. If we get a hand from Boris and his chums, that'll be great. But don't wait up.
Very wise words, I think, Atul. Yeah, I'm certainly not going to be holding my breath on that one. I think, Chris, I probably covered most of the questions in the chat. Anything else anyone wants to say as sort of a final comment or summary before we wrap up?
I think maybe it'd be good, sort of, we started with a couple of minutes from each, didn't we, about the last 18 months, then maybe the coming 18 months around this subject, maybe a quick round table as to where people feel that they can have an influence. Atul, we'll start with you.
Well, what I was going to share was when I was doing a little bit of research for this, I came across a great metaphor that we actually did use a bit back when we did a different version of it back when I was in professional services. And the metaphor was that for many people, this is like the Olympic Stadium, right? And there's a relay going on in the Olympic Stadium. And it's the same people who are passing the baton to their families, their friends, and the rest of us are trying to get into the Olympic Stadium, you know, and we can get into watch, and sometimes we can get into play. And I thought, yeah, actually that resonates with me. You know, I got into the stadium, but it was pretty hard going to get into the stadium. One of the things that I did through a whole complicated combination of circumstances is I ended up chairing the British Horse Racing Association, so the regulator of horse racing in the UK. And that in various forms had existed for 270 years. And I was only the third person to chair it who was not in the House of Lords, member of the aristocracy, or a knight of the realm. So I don't know if that's social mobility, but they've got a bit to go in horse racing.
You were waiting for a prompt. I think, Bharati, your middle.
Oh, right, my turn. Sorry. I guess what in terms of the next 18 months, I'm an eternal optimist. So, and I also believe in the ingenuity of business and to be creative and imaginative. I think there is a recognition that, you know, about this agenda, and I think particularly as we look at, you know, touching on politics again, if you look at where the Tories won seats in the Northeast, Northwest, Midlands, I mean, these are areas that need some focus when it comes to the social mobility agenda and jobs, and if we can get good jobs out there. So I am hopeful that we are going to start to see things moving in a more positive way. You'll have to ask me if I was right in 18 months' time.
There's your session for 18 months' time, Craig. We'll all come back and see how we got on. Mac, do you want to close this out?
Yes, I think my reflections on this broadly cover two areas. So the first is that social mobility is often an indicator of equality. So I think you opened the session with the quote from Boris Johnson about the distribution of talent versus the distribution of opportunities. And in looking at that, we need to look at how we arrive at this situation. So what are the institutions that play a key role in people's lives in terms of education, in terms of the legal system, in terms of public goods and public services generally. So in order to change social mobility and the dynamic at large, we also need to address some of the failings in these institutions and the kind of systems that govern our society. And the second is just about where I started in terms of the intersectional perspective around social mobility. We can't just look at social mobility as changing one thing. We need to look at it intersectionally. We need to understand the kind of the opportunity to do more. You know, it's not just necessarily about social mobility in relation to jobs or careers, but also in relation to how people experience and interact with businesses more generally. So not just from an employer perspective, but also from a service provision.
Good. So I think it just leads me on now to wrap up and to say thank you to all of our speakers. So Chris, Bharati, Mac, Atul, great session. Really enjoyed it. Very interesting. It's the first webinar I've seen on this topic specifically, actually. So I think we're ahead of the game. But great session, and the recording will be available on our website very shortly. So thank you again for your contributions